Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to today's Animals and Society Colloquium. My name is Carol Glasser, and I am with the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association. If you are in the ASA and you are interested in human-animal relationships, you should be in our section. So get a hold of me and I'll tell you how. But everybody here should know about and try to join the email list for ASI, the Animals and Society Institute, which is one of the co-sponsors along with the Animals and Society section of today's event in the Animals and Society Colloquium series. So I'm going to turn it over to Liz Herkey to tell you a little bit about ASI and then do the introductions for today's talk.
Thanks, Carol. And hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's colloquium. As Carol mentioned, today we have a distinguished speaker, Dr. Loredana Loy. And Dr. Loy will discuss the way media commentators address the consumption of meat and other animal products as contributors to climate change. She will also discuss dietary change as a form of individual climate action. As Carol mentioned, before we jump into the program, I do want to tell you a little bit more about the series, just in case it's your first time joining us. I do want to give props to Carol. This series is the brainchild of Carol's, and it is a joint project between the American Sociological Association, Animals and Society section, and the Animals and Society Institute. We do hope that if you are a sociologist, that you will join ASI and of course join the Animals and Society section. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Animals and Society Institute, ASI is dedicated to furthering the field of human-animal studies as it concerns the complex relationship between humans and other animals. ASI has 2 managed academic journals, a book series on human-animal studies. We are rebooting our undergraduate journal, our online no-cost journal. And we also have loads of resources for scholars, researchers, faculty, mental health, and other professionals. These resources and more can be found on our website, including a database of HAS-related academic programs. And we'll put links to all of these resources in the chat for you. Our HAS program director, Dr. Kale Argent, produces a monthly report that is chock full of information about the field, including ASI-related and general HAS news, conferences, publications, calls for papers, job opportunities, and grant funding. So we encourage everyone, non-academics or academics of any discipline, to sign up for the ASI HAS report. It is a valuable resource, and we hope you'll check it out, along with all of the other resources on the website. So on to today's talk. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Loredana Loy. Dr. Loy is a postdoctoral associate in the Rosenstiel School of the Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science at the University of Miami. She obtained her PhD in sociology from Cornell University in 2023. Her research uses mixed methodology to examine the way cultural, economic, and political forces converge to hinder efforts aimed at addressing the ecological and climate crises. And she seeks to understand how we can bring about the social transformations that are needed to address these crises. Among other places, her work has been published in Science and Public Policy, Climatic Change, Communications, Earth and Environment, and has been featured in a 2023 U.S. Senate congressional hearing, as well as reported in media outlets such as The Conversation, Salon, and the Nieman Journalism Lab. Dr. Loy, thank you so much for being with us today, and I turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you so much, Liz. And I'd like to share my screen before we move on to anything else. Just a second here. There we go. So yes, so thank you again. I'd like to thank the organizers. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Carol, for inviting me to speak today. And again, my name is Loredana Loy. I'm a postdoctoral associate at the University of Miami. And today I'll be speaking about Let Them Eat Kale, Class-Based Resentment in Conservative Opposition to Climate Action, which is research co-authored with my colleague at Brown University, Rachel Wetz, who couldn't be here with us today. So I'd like to start with giving you some background first about what motivated this research. So organized climate obstruction, also known as the climate counter movement, is regarded as one of the most important factors explaining the failure to address the climate crisis over the past few decades. This counter-movement has used a variety of strategies to incite opposition to climate action. Among these, some of the most prominently featured in the climate debates are the quasi-scientific and seemingly factual arguments used to promote climate abstraction discourses, such as casting doubt on climate science and spreading misinformation, which is also known as evidence skepticism, questioning the scientific process, and also known as process skepticism, and more recently, contesting proposals to address the crisis, also known as response skepticism. And while these types of arguments have, without a doubt, been important, a broad literature in political sociology and social psychology, and even and social movements, suggests that effective appeals to social identities are highly effective at swaying public opinion and spurring mobilization. However, these are less documented in the climate debates. So this is noteworthy because research on public opinion and political behavior has shown that people's evaluation of political issues is seldom motivated by cold cognitive assessments of facts, and instead are motivated or based on identity commitments, social group affiliations, and emotional responses. So given this, it is surprising that a robust literature on climate obstruction suggests that the most prominent discursive strategies of this highly successful climate counter-movement appear to rely on cognitive and rational justification and the contestation of facts. And within this smaller literature that focuses on identity appeals in climate obstruction, the focus is mainly on right-wing populist appeals and on social identities. And I just want to give you a quick overview of why these work with climate obstruction. So in the case of right-wing populism, this works really well because the traditional targets of hostility, such as immigrants and other marginalized groups, can be substituted with environmentalists. And in the same way, climate action advocates and climate organizations are easily labeled as bureaucracies of elites to kind of work with the narratives of right-wing populism. But ultimately, what's important here is that right-wing populist appeals in climate obstruction are an expression of hostility to liberal cosmopolitan elites rather than an engagement with the issue of climate change itself. And in the case of appeals to social identities, research has shown that, for example, national identity and tradition are used to defend consumption of animal products against measures designed to mitigate climate change in Sweden and the Netherlands. And we know this from the literature that consumption of meat and other animal products have long been linked to individuals' social group identities, such as class and masculinity. And we also know that they often uphold the production and maintenance of hegemonic masculinity. So things like labeling vegans and vegetarians, perceiving them as emasculated and labeling them with tropes such as soy boy. So given this discrepancy between the factual and effective arguments documented in the climate obstruction literature, the question that we are investigating in this piece is to what degree do climate obstruction discourses rely on at least putatively logical and scientifically justifiable reasoning in arguing against climate action proposals, and to what degree do they leverage more intuitive, emotive appeals to audiences' social identities to sway their opinions through less rational means? And to answer this question, we are looking at dietary change as a form of climate action. So basically the transition to a plant-based food system as a form of addressing the climate crisis. And the reason we are focusing on this, of course, among the most important ones are the fact that the growing literature is showing that this is an effective and immediately available form of climate action. However, at the same time, we know that whenever these type of suggestions are made in public, they raise a lot of contentiousness. So there's backlash and resistance against them. So discussions of transitions to plant-based diets spark outsized controversy among the public. At the same time, previous work suggests that the dietary change as a form of climate action has the capacity to elicit emotional responses from publics and stir up associations with specific group identities, just like the ones I just pointed out, like masculinity. So basically, we focus on dietary change because this is an area where we might expect to see the types of identity appeals that social movement scholars highlight as effective at swaying publics, but which have been rarely discussed in scholarly characterizations of the climate debate. And for this, we use the data that we use is basically the coverage of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, media coverage between 1989 and 2021. We are looking at both mainstream and conservative media outlets, and we are also including TV, so TV scripts from TV programs, and print media. Our methods are computational text analysis as well as qualitative analysis of text for the more in-depth understanding of the themes that we find. Excuse me a second. And findings, moving on to findings. So before I'll show you some of the examples and some of the findings, I just want to give an overview of what we found. So overall, there are strikingly different discussions being carried on across mainstream and conservative media. They differ both in terms of commentators' attitudes towards dietary change and in terms of whether they primarily reference logical argumentation or whether they reference affective identity appeals based in crafting, based on emotional and other types of identity appeals. So I want to discuss first the narrative and themes found in the conservative media, and then I'll quickly move on to mainstream media as well. So conservative media, we find basically no evidence of fact-based appeals arguing that dietary change as a form of climate action is ineffective or inappropriate. Instead, the discussion is characterized by appeals to class-based identities, especially populist-style appeals that motivated opposition to dietary change as a form of climate action through its association with liberal cultural elites, which are presented as immoral through accusations of hypocrisy and corruption. And so we found three kind of main themes here. First, elites as corrupt. Second, mockery of displays of liberal and elite cultural capital. And three, climate skepticism. And I'm going to give you some examples of each. So I'll start with the first one, environmental spokespeople cast as corrupt and or hypocritical elites. And here we have an example from Fox News from 2009, where the ex-vice president Al Gore is painted as a hypocrite for not changing his eating habits to coincide with climate action. And the quote reads, "If you really want to save the planet, Al, why don't you put down the cheeseburger and pick up your veggie burger? Time for maybe soy milk and tofurkey." And another example from the Wall Street Journal, also from 2009. Here we notice how the Wall Street Journal underlines Gore's elite status and his hypocrisy by noting that the Nobel Prize-winning global warming evangelist hasn't yet added vegetarianism to his climate prescription. And finally, one example in which environmental leaders are cast as corrupt. So here we see kind of a transition where suddenly we have environmentalists presented as members of the corrupt economic elite who are motivated by financial interest rather than genuine concern for the climate issue. So, and in these examples, commentators claim that Al Gore benefits from this type of climate action, that he benefits from a transition to a plant-based diet by investing in alternative protein companies and lobbying for legislation that would make such a transition possible. So remember, this is 2019, this example, versus the ones I showed earlier. So we can actually see a transition from the hypocrisy theme to the corruption theme. So the second theme here, mockery of displays of cultural capital, we see here how basically the tastes of diets of liberal cultural elite are presented as ridiculous and absurd. And some examples here as well. The first one from Fox News. Here we see basically commentators ridiculing Democrats for their alleged climate-friendly food choices and their efforts to make regular Americans embrace these choices. So the quote says, "As soon as the caucuses are over, Democrats will go back to trying to get Americans to eat soybeans and silkworms. That's not too bad if you deep fry them." So you see this kind of mockery and use of humor. This was from 2019. Another example from Fox News in which elites are portrayed as out of touch, removed from the needs of ordinary Americans who can only buy 2 burgers for $1 and cannot afford the Beyond Meat burger, which is like $17. So again, this is just basically dietary change mocked as elitist. Finally, an example from Fox News from 2019. Here we see the use, kind of the immorality fused with mockery. and the use of a famously apocryphal quote to portray Democrats as modern-day Marie Antoinette. And I'm going to read this out because it's just such a fantastic quote. So Democrats have become the party of smug, coastal elitism and everything that comes with it, and on food that makes them the party of veganism, artisanal arugula on a bed of even more artisanal arugula, and paying $27 for a small plate of aspic tuvalu and fusion cuisine. Let them eat kale, as Marie Antoinette actually said. So with that, I'm moving on to the last theme that we found in the conservative media, where we also found traditional climate denial and evidence of skepticism, where the reality, severity, or anthropogenic nature of climate change are questioned. However, what is important here is that these claims gain rhetorical force from their entwinement with identity appeals rather than being logically substantiated with factual or scientific evidence. So here's an example from Fox News from 2009, in which Glenn Beck, this is a commentator on Fox News, uses this kind of typical tropes that we see in climate skepticism, hoax, and hysteria. And he kind of links them with identity appeals to stoke anti-elite resentment. So he says, if you want me to buy into this hoax, this theory, give up meat, why? It seems like a small price to pay to save the entire planet. Another example from Fox News. Here we have representations of environmentalists as cultural elites, disconnected from the need and interests of ordinary Americans, also linked with representations of climate change as a distant fantasy that has no relevance to ordinary Americans. So again, the quote says, our cutting-edge Democrats want taxes on meat and want humans to eat bugs for the sake of lowering the sea levels in the Maldives in the year 2200. So again, going back to the question of whether the commentators use seemingly rational and emotional arguments to construct their narratives of climate obstruction, we conclude on the conservative media that populist appeals to class identity, especially appeals that call on resentment against highly educated cultural elites, are one prominent strategy to urge publics to reject climate action. And dietary change as a form of climate action is invoked to delegitimize environmentalists. So there's no rational engagement with this proposal. And finally, the goal is to construct a dichotomy between ordinary folk and ethically compromised elites that could appeal to class-based identities and stoke resentment towards environmentalists, and by proxy towards climate action. One note here is that the conservative media did not appear to make appeals to hegemonic masculinity in their discussion of meat consumption, despite the literature that shows that gender identities are linked to meat consumption and masculinity. And with that, I'm going to move on to the mainstream sample. So here, on the mainstream media, dietary change was generally discussed as an effective form of individual climate action. Commentators highlighted the environmental benefits of transitioning to a plant-based food system, as well as the readily available nature of the solution. However, commentators also discussed the political and cultural challenges of implementing this type of climate action, and we also found some oppositional arguments, and I'm going to give you some examples again of each. So first one, dietary change is effective. Here's an example from CNN, and you probably can't see it because of this. So I moved this to see the CNN logo. So CNN from 2019, here's commentator Neil Lewis saying, we will have to reduce our meat consumption given the mammoth environmental crisis we have found ourselves in. And also a dietary shift is important because of the rapid changes that are needed to limit global warming to 1.5. In this category, commentators also implicitly endorse this strategy by, for example, offering USDA nutritional expert tips and tips on how to incorporate plant-based dishes into everyday routine. This was also from CNN. Also, commentators discuss scientific aspects related to this solution, such as the contributions of meat and dairy production to global emissions, deforestation, animal welfare, and species extinction, and often cited the IPCC, and also cautioned against the continued disregard for the role of agriculture in climate change. Oops. Challenges. So this is the second category when the commentators talked about challenges. And they basically explored political or cultural challenges to adopting this form of climate action, including entrenched habits, traditions, and norms. For example, one series of news segments simultaneously highlighted the potential efficacy of dietary transition as a climate solution and its likelihood of facing resistant and conservative and rural states such as Texas, and I quote, where beef, the biggest food culprit in greenhouse gas production, is a way of life. And finally, we also found some oppositional arguments, right? So discussions here tended to resemble arguments that scholars have characterized as response skepticism or discourses of delay, where commentators simultaneously acknowledge the reality and severity of climate change, but then leverage ostensibly logical arguments to argue against a particular response. So specifically, commentators disputed the appropriateness and need for dietary change as a form of climate action and suggested unproven or questionable methods for as alternatives. For example, a form of climate delay known as technological optimism. And here's an example from CNN where a commentator is proposing to feed cows seaweed to get rid of emission. And this is actually a very popular trope that has been since debunked in the peer review literature. And another example, this one from the New York Times, where we see this quote from an industry-funded PR group called the Center for Consumer Freedom, who they say, it is beyond dispute that any connection between meat production and global warming is a false one. Go buy the hybrid, pay a premium for alternative energy sources, but eating tofu instead of sirloin, it's not going to make a difference. So to summarize, the mainstream media sample, mainstream media discussion generally endorsed dietary change. Let me just move this away, okay, as a form of climate action. They attempted to balance narratives by inviting opposite view, and ultimately opposition was rare, and when encountered, it was grounded in logical arguments, even if sometimes dubious and scientific claims, in line with well-documented contrarian tactics, such as casting doubt on the effectiveness or desirability of climate mitigation strategies. In conclusion, these findings provide evidence that populist appeals to class-based resentment against highly educated cultural elites are one prominent strategy to urge the public to reject climate solutions. And they point to the relevance of effective and identity-based appeals in shaping climate action. While the climate obstruction literature has overall emphasized the role of misinformation and quasi-scientific claims in sowing doubt about the need to address climate change, we here have documented a different strategy relying on invocation of emotion and construction of oppositional identities. Along with other tactics, this could help explain how opponents of climate action have historically been successful at delaying meaningful climate action. And by portraying climate concern as a hallmark of contemptible elite groups, conservative commentators may have activated resentment against these groups and, by extension, undermine climate strategies. Meanwhile, climate advocates have tended to favor technoscientific framings that portray political, economic, and scientific elites as leading the efforts to address the climate crisis. And this way, they potentially play into conservative and populist framings that climate change is an elite project. So a technocratic framing distances climate phenomenon from the experiences of everyday people, while appeals imbued with personal meaning can enable more accessible forms of engagement. This suggests opponents of climate actions are using effective strategies for public engagement that advocates have tended to neglect. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Loy. Now we will take questions from the audience. So you can ask questions either by raising your hand and then I will see you and call on you, or you can just type your question into the chat. And what I will do is monitor the chat and I can call those questions out. We already have one question in the chat from Ken, so we'll start with that. And that says, why label one part of media conservative and populist while the other part is called mainstream? Why not liberal or progressive?
Carol, can we respond now?
Yep, it's all you.
Oh, it's just because in the mainstream media, we, if we were to just include liberal or progressive, that would be just maybe MSNBC or something, but we have more than that. So like, we have, the sample includes different, it could be labeled liberal. In fact, in some of the parts of the paper, we do label that. So it's just basically a matter of labels. But progressive would be kind of like more to the left, which would be a different sample, I think.
So did you intentionally sample like middle and just left of middle for your sample?
No, we basically try to do we try to kind of cover everything under conservative and then oppositional to conservative.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? It looks like Monica's hand is up, so you can go ahead and
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah.
Hi, Monica.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk, and especially the thinking about these things as oppositional strategies. What I've been noticing more is, especially on the spaces that I'm on, is more of a progressive leftist rejection of any kind of individual action. So seeing individual actions such as avoiding meat as corporate driven and as a corporate strategy to keep to make individuals bear the burden of, climate action, when in fact this should be corporations that are the ones doing the work, right? And so I often struggle with these arguments, right? Because they really focus on like, there's nothing you should be asked for as an individual. It's corporations that are making you do this work, and that's entirely from a sort of progressive leftist point of view. And I'm wondering if you've looked at that at all or discussed that at all.
So this is so interesting that you're bringing this up, because my other work is actually looking at that, how how individual responsibility and how it's entwined with these debates about whether is it corporations just pushing responsibility onto the consumer, or whether and we have a paper that's coming up now which compares basically the oil industry with the agriculture industry, because basically the oil industry had promoted individual responsibility through their rhetoric, like switch off your lights, all these like kind of individual responsibility measures, while the animal agriculture industry has not embraced any kind of individual measures. But to your point also that we are seeing a lot of rhetoric around like, don't worry about yourself because it's not your you're not going to be able to do anything, but corporations should take action. But it's not part of this research. This is not what we're looking at here. But I agree that that's a very, very important area. And I'm in another stream of research. I'm looking at that as well.
Yeah, one of the things I've been doing, and this might be in keeping with what you ended with, is I'm trying the strategy of saying like, the kind of foods that I eat as a vegan, for example, are the kind of foods that working class people created and lived on, for many generations, that there is a cultural history of eating vegetable-based dishes in many parts of the world. And that's part of my inheritance as, a working class person, right? And so I try and use that. The other one is...
Yeah, but also, if you remember in the beginning of the presentation, I brought up the fact that there's a growing literature that shows that this is one of the most effective and immediately available ways of climate action. And this is what is important here. It's something that doesn't require infrastructure change. We don't need to build anything to move to this. And so basically, that is one reason to always, bring up.
Awesome.
Thank you for your question, Monica.
We have two questions in the chat that are, I would say, questions about your sample. So one question is about whether your study was focused solely in the US, which I believe it was.
Yes, it was solely the US, yes.
And then regarding the conservatives, is the emphasis of your data based on the television channel Fox News?
No, we sampled, but Fox News, of course, is like prominently, displaying, because they are the ones who are picking up the most, but we had Wall Street Journal as well. So not just Fox News.
And then also a question about the year.
Actually, I can, sorry, if you want, I have actually a slide that shows our sample. Give me a second here. I'll go back to it. And I think I have it at the end where can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah, here we go. So this is the sample. So we had MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, New York Times, USA Today, which is, USA Today kind of that's a mainstream, versus MSNBC, which is more like a left leaning, and then Wall Street Journal.
This also answers the second question, which was about the years in your sample.
Yes.
Yeah, someone noticed that a lot of the examples you gave were pre-2010 and asked if there was more modern, I think is the word they used, stuff in the sample. So you went through 2021.
Yes, and also we have to remember that this kind of talk begins to increase a bit later on, right? But we tried to look all the way back to see if it was even coming up in 1980, like, you know, when the climate change discussions around the IPCC were happening. And so the best examples I picked are from the, you know, 2009 and 2000, like the recent decades, because the talk, of course, increases around those times, when the IPCC starts to include dietary change in their recommendations.
I have a question that's a bit outside of your study, but since you've done this study, I know that your ears perk up when you hear certain things. So I'm just wondering, in the current election cycle, when there's just a lot more rhetoric going around, is this an issue that you hear being talked about at all, or is this sort of being washed out by other issues and other types of rhetoric?
Sorry, you mean dietary change in general or climate change? Or sorry, can you say more?
Both of them. Yeah, both of them. I'm just wondering if, as you've been listening to the news cycle surrounding the election, are people having a lot of discourse around dietary change as it links to climate change?
So unfortunately, there's like the climate change discussions are minimal, even as like forget dietary change. They're not even talking about climate change in general, which is, you know, if you that should be part of the political discussion right now. And and this is just my opinion, because you asked about the current events, right? You're talking about the current political cycle, right? No, so I think climate change is like glaringly missing from discussions on both sides. But I mean, what's important here that not even Democrats are talking about it much, unfortunately. And we saw the in the debates, in the vice presidential debate, there was one question and it was kind of addressed really quickly, and then there was no returning back to the climate change question.
Does anyone else in the audience have questions right now? I have just a procedural question. Like, you had a huge amount of data.
Yeah.
How did you go through the process of coding? Were you using some sort of, like, were you reading everything and coding for certain words, or were you doing word searches or auto coding? How did you get through all of that?
So that's where we use the computational text analysis to curate our sample, right? So basically, that because it was such a massive sample, we use computational text analysis, basically LDA, which is lyrical. I never get it right, but it's a topic modeling. Basically, looks for topics, right? And that helps us find the discussions around dietary change in this massive sample of coverage around the climate change narratives around the IPCC. So once we reduce those samples, we have like much more manageable kind of samples on both sides. And that's when we start doing, qualitative text analysis on those, looking like first we had an inductive step in which we kind of let the themes come out of the organically from the text. And we identified some themes there. And then we look and we try to kind of categorize them and link them together with, under larger umbrellas. But indeed, I don't think this could have been done by hand because it was too big. So that first initial step was important, the computational text analysis part.
And it was all written, or was it written and
it was TV programs, but we use transcripts which you can find like on Vanderbilt archive, television archives.
Cool. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? I'll pose, Ken's hand's up. Yep. Oh, you're on mute, Ken.
Just to keep it going, Follow up to my earlier question. You indicated that the populist side of the non-mainstream media use the argument about elites, the critique of elites. Couldn't it be said that the progressive side also uses that argument, but has a different set of elites in mind, like the corporation folks? I mean, isn't there some balance in terms of the two sides of the media, the populist side and the progressive side, in terms of their moving away from simply evidence-based rational argument?
Sorry, you broke up a bit, but I think I got the most of it. Yes, I'm not sure if I understood this correctly, but no, we didn't find elitism arguments in the mainstream sample. We only found it in the conservative sample, and used as a proxy to kind of stoke opposition to climate action, which was not the case in the other part, in the mainstream. I'm not saying this could not be happening around other types of topics, but around the topic of dietary change, we didn't find it.
So you didn't find in the who's your progressive media in your list there?
Was by progressive, we mean that's why I'm labeling it mainstream, because we put together both liberal. We had New York Times, we had MSNBC, we had USA Today. So like there was a mix of like the cutoff from like right wing versus everyone else.
So I read The Nation, which is a progressive mag zine.
Yeah, it wasn't included. No,
I understand that, but I think if you look at that, you'll see that they are as critical.
It's breaking up. Sorry, Ken, you're breaking up, and your screen is. We didn't hear that. Can you repeat? You're like frozen.
Okay. Did you hear me, Carol?
No, your screen froze.
Okay. Well, my point was about The Nation, that they use a cultural elite argument as well, in the same way that the populists do, but it's a different elite.
About dietary change?
About climate change and dietary change, yes. They are very critical of the monopolistic-like entities that produce our food.
So, but it's not about individual appeals to like people. You're saying that they're kind of painting a systemic transition as an elitist project.
Well, I mean, they're individuals who are running these corporations, and
yes, but that's a different argument from the one that we're making in the paper. Yes, but I get it. It's very interesting. Thank you.
I had a question emailed to me by someone who couldn't be here today. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna pose that question to you. And the question was, how can the concepts of class-based resentment influence public policy on dietary change?
Sorry, Carol, say that again.
How can the concept of class-based resentment, so like how can your findings, what do they suggest about how it can influence public policy on dietary?
Yes, exactly. So, well, in the conclusion, I kind of touched a bit upon this. There are bigger issues here, right? One of them being that if, so for example, climate advocates have been focusing on like techno fixes and presenting, kind of the approach to address climate change as an elitist project, right? And so that can result in the disconnect of the public from engaging, right? So then policymakers, have to kind of be aware of these kind of appeals to be able to counter them. So that's where I think this is helpful, to be aware that these identity appeals are happening and that they kind of parallel other types of appeals that help contribute to climate obstruction. So, just awareness results in ability to develop something that might be better. But we're not there. I mean, we are seeing that climate policy efforts are not quite there yet when it comes to dietary change, right? At least here in the US. But it's a very good question, and one that we are keeping in mind.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Something that strikes me as interesting is that I feel like people who are embracing dietary change are using the climate argument in a very different way than people who are trying to argue for climate and embracing the individual dietary change argument. It's not really anything you can get at in the research you were doing because you're only looking in one direction, but I wonder if you have thoughts on that, like why is there kind of this disjuncture?
Climate, so dietary change as a as a form of climate action versus dietary change as a form of something else.
Versus like talking about climate action as a reason you might engage in dietary change.
Say more, Carol. I'm not sure I'm following.
When I hear people, and this is, just a layperson's interpretation here, but when I hear people talking about dietary change, it seems like they throw in, well, and it's good for the environment at the end when they're not convincing anyone,
Right.
And I'm wondering if it's a similar thing or a different thing happening when people are talking about like, we need to do stuff for the climate, we need to do X, Y, and Z, and you should probably change your diet. It just doesn't seem like dietary change just doesn't seem like something super popular, so people don't want to tag it on to the climate argument. And people who embrace veganism, maybe climate isn't their driver, and vegans understand that, so they tack it on to the end of the other arguments they make.
Yes. So I think there's some research actually by Nuria Almiron in Spain, if I'm not mistaken. They even show that the kind of this move towards arguing for dietary changes as a form of climate action kind of hurt a bit the animal rights movement arguments, right? Because it's now again the same issue that the animal rights issue is kind of put aside, and we're only talking about dietary change and switching to plant-based diets, a new food system in terms of addressing climate change. And again, we're forgetting about the actual problem, the ethical problem, and the justice problem. Yeah. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but we can see it in that way, but we can also see this kind of research in a way that we're bringing this kind of a discussion to larger audiences who wouldn't otherwise think of dietary change at all, right? So especially in sociology, where we know that this kind of talk is very marginalized, right? So this is a way of kind of opening it up to everyone to think about this problem, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. This is an interesting question from Valerie. Are you seeing differences in the style of communication between the populist and the mainstream as well? So examples she's giving, like, do they have differences in their use of stories or metaphors versus facts, or simple versus complicated narratives?
So you mean other than what the examples I've given?
Yeah, like in general, like, is the overall style of communication very different? Like, besides what they're saying, is the way that they're saying it.
So other than content, or I'm not sure what style of communication, what they mean by that.
Her examples are like, is one side more likely to use stories or lean on metaphors versus leaning on facts, or giving very simple narratives versus giving very complicated narratives?
Yes. So, I mean, I can only speak to what we focused on here, which is, the use of kind of these parallels, to use the elites as a target to make other points. So the subtle kind of priming of the audiences, to reject climate action. And of course, the stories, I mean, yes, I mean, in the mainstream and liberal media, as I shown in the examples, they're very matter of fact. They focus, and I said there is actually engagement with the problem, with the proposal of dietary change as a form of climate action. They are engaging with it. They're taking it into consideration. They're talking about it. In the conservative media, they're not, it's only used as like as a joke, right? As like to kind of stoke resentment. There's no engagement with it. So that's also can be, I guess, seen as a style of communication. Yeah, there's no engagement with the facts, right? It's like always kind of tangential kind of stories to reach some sort of, to make some sort of a point. And the use of humor, I mean, that's a style of communication. Like we saw a lot of, like, there's a lot of mockery, right? A lot of mockery of dietary change and of people who embrace dietary change as a form of climate action, right?
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Before we end today, I do want to announce that we will have another colloquium coming up in about a month. I'm going to look for the flyer for it right here, if you give me a second. Liz, do you want to introduce that colloquium while I madly search for the flyer I should have had ready? Okay, so that colloquium will be part of the, yes, I'll let Liz explain it because there's a big exciting week going on at Animals and Society Institute.
I am technologically challenged at the moment. Sorry. Carol, if you could look up the flyer, because I don't have it in front of me either, but I will say that what is exciting that is going on via ASI that week is #HARA Week, which is a Human-Animal Relationship Awareness Week. And that was something that was started by one of our staff members a number of years ago and has caught on to some extent. And so we have a social media kit that we're going to be sending out and just encouraging everyone to use that tag that week. And we'll be starting our social media campaign on the Sunday of that week. And our colloquium,
Yes, I put it up there, but it showed up as a comment to someone else. Sorry, I'll post it again.
okay,
But
the title is Should Animal Advocacy Avoid Causing Guilt and Shame?
Yes, and that will be on November 13th at 9 a.m. Pacific and 12 p.m. Eastern Time with Elisa Ayatolla from, I forget what university she's from. She's from Finland and she's got a lot of really great work and talks a lot about empathy in her work. So we're really excited to have her for that talk as well. We have a couple minutes, so if anyone thought of a last minute question, we have a minute to squeeze it in. Otherwise, no one ever complained on a meeting ending a few minutes early on a work day. So if anyone has a question, let us know. Otherwise, I will be sending out a link to everyone who is registered of this video when it's ready. I think this is a really interesting time to be talking about rhetoric and political differences in rhetoric. So I'm sure a lot of people can think of probably interesting ways to add this into their class to get to talk about the environment, animals, and politics all at once. So that's probably something pretty exciting for this crowd. Dr. Loy, thank you so much for the opportunity to hear about your work. This was a fabulous presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Carol, you want to sit after for a second?
Sure. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Liz.